Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Let me share my screen with you, uh, and we'll get cracking soon enough. Um, so yeah, I describe my work as helping teams to become autonomous. The word autonomy, I'll perhaps define as I see it right now, because it can mean lots of things. But it typically, in my view, means a high degree of freedom, possibly a radical degree of freedom. But with each increment of freedom that you get an equal increment of responsibility. So I'm not talking about some utopia where we all do whatever we want. Although I kind of am, so long as it comes with an equal amount of responsibility that we take for that freedom. I'm reminded, I think it's in Spider-Man, isn't it? With great power comes great responsibility. It's some sort of version of that. So I help teams to do that. I describe it as teams stepping up and leaders stepping back. Quite often there's a bit of a dance to do with both of those things, and it involves a bunch of processes, practices, tools, systems, as well as maybe more the psychological side of things. And that typically involves us learning to coordinate better with each other, as well as let go a little bit once in a while, which I'm sure if you're anything like me, you'll struggle with a little bit as well. So that's a bit about me. Do you want me
Fab.
to get in there, Mel?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah? All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to use this framework, which is the group familiar with this? Yeah?
I will tell everyone, in case you're not,
Yeah.
hopefully, if you've bumped into Tilt before, you will hopefully have seen this model because we spend a lot of time talking about it. It is the shifts that we see as being important for us to transform charities to be more innovative and adaptable. There are five key shifts that we want to see, and we're going to be framing our conversation, John and myself, around those today. You can see Julia shared a link to the model, find out more about the model. It's actually adapted from a graphic from ThoughtWorks that was not for the charity sector. So we've adapted it to the charity sector. But that's the process, the shifts that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. And so I think
And
we've already done this first one, right?
yes, so John and I are going to focus mostly on the bottom four shifts. There is a great example of this shift from focusing on outputs to outcomes, which we're not going to talk too much about today, in the previous summer story season from last month, which was Rosie talking about the shift in business planning amnesty. So we'll be sharing that story in our newsletter shortly. The key thing for this shift is all about moving away from talking about measuring and encouraging a focus on things and doing, and instead moving towards a focus on what difference the work is making and why we're doing the work. So that's as much as we're going to say on this shift today, and we're going to now focus our way through the bottom four.
Yeah, so I'm going to use this as a kind of agenda. And for each one, I'm going to share some metaphors and stories that hopefully give context to it. I'm going to share some practices and tools and maybe a few case studies peppered in there. So hopefully you'll get a kind of diversity of ways of approaching this. And I believe that if you work on all four of these shifts, in my experience, it's possible to get a team to be incredibly autonomous, even to work without management. I mean, you can go very, very far with this, and I'll try and share some examples of that as we go along. So let me get started. I'm going to start with hierarchies to networks. So this is a big shift, and there's a reason why we struggle to make this shift, and it's because we almost all of us grew up in hierarchies. You can't get rid of hierarchies, nor would that necessarily be desirable. Put a group of mammals in a room, and you'll quickly see that there's some sort of hierarchy playing out. Sometimes they're very valuable. They're based on experience. So, for example, I might start naturally deferring to somebody more experienced than me in a room. That would be, or who has more expertise. So, we're not trying to just get rid of all hierarchies. There are versions of hierarchies that are slow and quite often illegitimate. So we feel beneath someone in a structure that's been made by a person on a piece of paper, but fundamentally it's not actually serving us. And to share this, I've actually got a personal story. This is my grandma. She's in this picture, I think she's 101 years old. It's her birthday on Sunday. She's 102. She's super cute. She's amazing. She's totally with it. She's total rock star. And she stays at our house occasionally, so she'll come over when my mum's away and stay with us. And sadly, a couple of years ago, she fell over. Right, so she's upstairs in the room next to me. I hear a bang. I go in, and she's hit her head on the floor. So quickly, obviously, I call the paramedic. She's bleeding a lot. So the paramedic comes. The paramedics were lovely. Quickly, we make them a cup of tea. They're having all sorts of lovely chats with her. They're looking after her. They're starting to tend to her wound. So I'm starting to feel a lot better, thinking, right, we've got this sorted. It's bedtime soon. And then the paramedic says to me, I'm really sorry. It just needs a few steri strips, but I'm scared of getting sued these days. So we're going to have to go to hospital. So we drive to hospital. It's like half an hour away. We wait for ages. Eventually, she gets a room. It's 11 p.m. Anyway, we spend all night in hospital. She's in this like buzzy room with loads of lights flickering, sounds everywhere. We see probably 5 different nurses. Some of them are in a real rush. A few make some pretty weird faux pas in regard to her care. And at 8 a.m. the next day, a doctor comes, says, oh, this just needs a few steri strips, puts them on, and we go home. So we spend 12 hours, just under like 9, 10 hours in hospital, something like that, that just weren't needed. So if you look at why this happened, there's a bunch of things going on. The hospital trip wasn't needed because the paramedic actually had the knowledge to look after her, right? Then once we were in hospital, the bed wasn't needed. Her being in a hospital room where she couldn't sleep because of the lights, age 100, is probably more dangerous than just the risk of putting a few steri strips on. So the cost to the NHS is huge because we've seen 5 people instead of one. And eventually we get to this doctor who was exhausted because they'd probably seen 100 people that just needed steri strips that day. So the cost is huge financially. The cost to the patient is obviously huge. And all this is because the guy from the ambulance wasn't really allowed to just put some steri strips on. Right, this is ultimately what's happening. So the cost of this is massive, and it comes from Fordism, right? So Fordism, most of us are familiar with. Early 20th century, I believe, is when scientific management really starts to take over. And it's why we have terms like line managers. It's why we have human resources departments, and it's why we have supervisors. It's from factory lines. And it's not anymore, I think, relevant to knowledge work. And there's some reasons why this breaks down. Typically, in these systems, we have a centralized system, right? And here, what I've done is I've swapped the machine in the middle, that's often referred to as a single point of failure, with a client of mine, Tom. And so in a centralized network, you have a single point of failure, and that is that server that if it breaks, the whole system breaks. And in this system, it's the doctor. Right, everything went up to the doctor. For many, many people, it goes to the doctor. So eventually the doctor's got no bandwidth and is at breaking point themselves. So it's no good for the leader in this scenario, but it's certainly not good for the system because if that breaks, the whole thing breaks. So moving from hierarchies to networks often means moving from centralization to decentralization. So here you can see we've moved Tom. He's no longer the single point of failure. We've put him on the edges. And then in this system on the right, there's way more bandwidth. We can compute and process way more decisions in any given moment. So the maths really work out. This is the equivalent of all the paramedics being allowed to apply steri strips. You would just get far more people getting far better care far quicker. And we don't rely on the doctor at this point. So there's a speed and there's a kind of resilience. We could change this for a nature metaphor, which we'll do later on. In terms of decision making, we're moving from those little dots at the bottom, those are the customers. This is my nan, right? These little icons at the bottom. And they go up to the paramedic, then up to the nurse, then eventually they get to the doctor the next morning. What we want is this. My nan speaks to the paramedic speaks to my nan, and that's where it stops. It doesn't have to go up. Now, what you do need quite often is advice to stop us making mistakes. So you can see I've created a dotted line across that bottom line. And that is so that the paramedics can speak to each other, right? They can form teams, they can advise one another, they can get feedback. And that's how you can make quick decisions without unnecessary risk. So this is the shift from hierarchies to networks. It looks something like this, rather than going up and down, it's this circular motion. And whilst this is an icon, this is an actual org chart. The one on the right is Tom's org chart from this organization I was mentioning. And each of these dots is a set of responsibilities that a human has. And they might have responsibilities in different circles. And what this means is that they have huge freedom, but they're also responsible for whatever those dots are. And this is about organizing ourselves around the work that needs doing, rather than organizing ourselves around hierarchical structures and power. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what we're talking about with this first shift from hierarchies to networks.
And on that, we have a question for you to reflect on. How, on a scale of 1 to 5, how networked is your team? Again, I'm going to pop up a poll and let's see what you all think. How networked is your team? Thinking about what Jon's just shared, on a scale of 1 to 5, how networked is your team at the moment? All right, I'm going to end the poll so that you can all see how you've voted. So
Okay.
a fair split there. Most folks saying they feel about in the middle in terms of networks versus hierarchical approach. 19% of you saying quite hierarchical. How does that relate to? Sorry, Jon?
I'm thrilled to not see anything on very hierarchical. That's good.
And great to see that some folks are feeling that their team is quite networked or even very networked.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Nice.
So with this, feel free to click close, and we'd love to give you just 1 minute, a micro reflection in your journals or whatever you've got, and just take a moment to ask yourself what tiny thing might shift you towards being more networked. And emphasis on the tiny, like very small changes done regularly over weeks can create really amazing changes in the future. What tiny thing might shift you towards being more networked? Feel free to share in the chat as well if that feels good. Asking for more viewpoints and opinions before making a decision. Absolutely. So actually, Yvette, we're going to have a decision-making bit later, and I think your comment there will be really relevant. All right. We're going to do a few of these, so let me move this back into the presentation. Information sharing.
Another couple of responses. Yeah,
great. Yeah, directly with teams, absolutely. You don't need to go through others. It's just a bit of a waste. So we'll talk about information sharing. This is great. Regular prioritization. Yeah, wonderful. All right, I think these are all going to start linking up, which is nice to see. So you'll see that they all work with each other, these different areas. So let's carry on then, because there's this talk of confidence that's just come out in the chat. So confidence, probably something close to empowerment. So let's have a little talk about that. Most of us are probably familiar with this quite sad Gallup survey, right? Only 23% of people at work tend to be engaged. 62% are like, nah, and 15% they say actively trying to sink your ship. Now they say the cost, if you take a disengaged employee, 34% of that salary is fundamentally wasted. So this is what it looks like. I asked ChatGPT to help me create the version of this for the NHS ambulance staff simulation. So we've got a headcount of apparently roughly 25,000. I don't know if that's correct. A disengagement rate of 41% apparently. I found some burnout statistics from ambulance staff, so that was quite upsetting. That's 10,500 disengaged team members. They're on a median salary of 28 grand apparently. And so if the cost of disengagement is 34%, that's 9,000 per disengaged employee. So that is nearly 300 million pounds spent on disengagement, essentially. So the cost of this empowerment is absolutely huge. And meeting this absolutely lovely paramedic who couldn't quite do his job, I'm not surprised. I'd add all the way to the hospital. He just asked my nan to tell him more stories. So the level of care is amazing. So when we create these network structures, what it allows for is our intrinsic motivation to come out, because we can start having more freedom to have different roles rather than be pigeonholed. And with that comes a degree of responsibility that hopefully matches our appetite for it. And so what we're able to do is go and take responsibility for our dominant roles, as well as potentially others that come out. And I've got a couple of really nice examples. So this is from the same travel company I was telling you about earlier. And Amelia, top right here, she works in PR and had a great idea to put on an event. And because they're incredibly empowered, she was able to do that. And what you have bottom left is the second edition of this event that's just happened, that had, I think, 50 to 100 participants. It was in this like beautiful venue, lovely food, really great community vibes. And this would normally be outside of her job, right? This would not be her job. And yet, because she had the idea, it's possible that this can happen. So there's also the cost of not being empowered, right? Which is to not run events like this. And we often forget that cost, right? We think, oh, it might be risky to empower someone, but there's all the good stuff that you don't know could happen that happened. Similar for them, they had a guy called Ben, worked in strategy, and he had an idea for a new business. And they've just launched, they've got their first company, their first client going at the moment. And this is an entirely separate organization that they're now setting up, and it's just kind of blossomed out of the thing, right? But if the leader had been super controlling, this wouldn't have been possible, right? And it's because we have this freedom and responsibility in equal measures. So what does empowerment look like? This is Ben's job description. So what you can see here, I'm sorry, it's a little small on the screen. It's using the same system to navigate our org chart that you saw earlier. Each of these cards is a role that Ben holds. And the expression I use is Ben is the CEO of his roles, right? Which means that he has authority. He can make decisions for each of these roles. And with that authority comes accountability. He's also accountable for delivering the goals that are within each of these roles. And he's a part of setting those goals each year. So what this enables us to see is who has authority to make decisions over what. Now, interestingly, the CEO actually can't trump Ben on some of these decisions because they're his roles. They're not the CEO's roles. He has an entirely different set of roles. And so this now enables us to be empowered to go and do our jobs to the best of our ability. You'll see later that doesn't mean doing it alone. But nonetheless, what we have clarified is what we're empowered over, and therefore what we're not empowered over. To give you a small tip, hopefully this will just be something you can apply pretty quickly in your teams. One thing that really helps is just the way we have meetings, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of this with your work with Tilt potentially, or other methods that you've learned. But the main shift is moving from directive meetings to crowdsourced ones. So a directive meeting, typically someone's called the meeting, quite often they're hierarchically above others, and they set the agenda. Quite often we don't know why we're going to the meeting. The notes are poorly taken, we're not sure if it's relevant to us or if it's just annoying in the middle of the day. A crowdsourced meeting has basically the main part of the meeting is that everybody gets to input into the agenda. And then we go and talk about each person's topic and we try and get their needs met. So by default, the entire meeting is irrelevant because you get to bring whatever you want to bring to the meeting. And you're there to help your colleagues solve their issues. So by the end of this, I've been in meetings like this where we've come out having made all sorts of decisions that we can't do when the whole agenda is driven by one person. And this is a really simple process that I recommend you follow. It goes, get everyone to check in, get everyone to put their topics on a Google sheet that you can all see, and then go through to item by item, ask that person what do they need from this topic, and then help them meet it. Importantly, you always have a facilitator running the meeting, and their job isn't to lead the meeting as much as to guide each person to get what they need from it. And this is incredibly empowering. So a different way to think of engagement, this is my client Nick. He just said everyone's buzzing. Right. I love that way of putting what can happen, that word engagement, which is slightly like jargony these days, into the way someone feels in these sessions. And the last tip for those of you who are in somewhat leadership positions, but to be honest, it works for anybody, including parents, is to be more coach-like if we want to be empowering. So the role of a manager, if there is one in the future, I think will simply to be a great coach. And the best question you can have is, what do you think? So when someone comes to you with a problem, how do I do this? What do you think of this? Typically, they're asking for permission. And in the process of doing that, typically they're disempowering themselves. And it's not surprising because, you know, up until the age of probably 16, you had to ask for permission to go to the toilet at school. So not many of us really have a deep feeling of what it's like to be empowered. So when someone comes to you with a question, even if you know the answer, go, oh, what do you think? Any ideas? You know, try to do it as non-patronizingly as possible. You might need a few others. Oh, what options have you thought of? You know, I've got a bunch. But it's really, really helpful. And over time, they'll come for less. And when they do come, it will be for genuine help and support and coaching. And hopefully you'll have helped that person. And what's beautiful about it is I've had people say to me that their home lives have changed after a while because they now feel more confident to speak up and to assert their thoughts and feelings. Leslie, I'll share a link to the crowdsourced meeting stuff at the end. So hopefully that gives you some tips on being on what it might be like to move from control to empowerment. And as I said, with a meeting format, it's really key to think of the role of a facilitator. And this facilitation is an absolute superpower in these kinds of environments. Elle, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about
Yeah,
this.
I couldn't miss the opportunity to tell you all, if you haven't already heard about Tilt's Facilitation Skills for Changemakers course, which sets you up to do exactly that, to facilitate meetings where progress is made, decisions are made, and also give you the confidence to adapt in the moment, but ultimately to bring together meetings that have the right people in them, and not to have a meeting if you don't need it, which is key, but also that when you bring those people together, you have the confidence to manage it inclusively, to meet the needs of everybody who's there and get stuff done. Julia will share a link in the chat to find out more about the course. And yeah, thanks, Jon, for sharing promising to share a link to how to run those more collaborative meetings. It's it can be really, really transformative.
So I'll share a video tutorial to that after, as well as some templates. For now, could we get another poll going?
Yeah.
On a scale of 1 to 5, how empowered or empowering is your team?
So yeah, you can answer this either way. I was umming and ahhing about whether to have it as how empowering or how empowered is your team.
Yeah.
So could be either, whatever feels right for you. Okay, looks like most of you have voted. Here are the results.
Okay, this is great. So never the bottom one, always a few of the top one, 7% again. So we're seeing some sort of theme here on the shift. It's just better than the middle, I'd say, is the average right now, which is really nice to see. All right, and along with that, how about taking a little moment to journal as well? What tiny thing might shift you towards being more empowered or towards being able to empower others potentially?
Being more empowering.
I do like that idea of how can I empower myself? Because quite often the limits to our empowerment are our own beliefs.
Yes.
Get told off.
Someone popped in the chat that their small action to being more networked is asking for permission less and just doing.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something that we in Tilt are big fans of. I know you are too, John, which is ask forgiveness, not permission, because so often actually we may well already have the power that we need. And yeah, let's use it.
Yeah, shared agenda building. It makes someone feel like they're allowed to contribute. You know, that itself is empowering.
And the Charity Agile Leaders Club, which many of you come along to, is a great example of a crowdsourced meeting structure. We have an introduction, a bit of a check-in, and then the main content is what are everyone's questions, what are their challenges, what can we help each other with, and we'll vote on which topics we'd most like to work our way through, and we get through as many of them as possible.
Great work, Nicole. Answering questions with questions is a skill. It's so valuable for everybody. Quite often I can't believe what comes back, and I realize that my answer wasn't as good as the answer that person came up with. Beautiful. And Carmen, in terms of less formal environments, you know, I think there is a kind of way of being here, you know, even with our friends, with our families, around a dinner table, you know, it's possible to go and bring more people in and, you know, try and share I mean, when I'm at dinner parties, if there's a group, I can't stop myself but bring the silent person in slightly, or, you know, it's all sorts of little things that we can do day to day, and I think they're fantastic for our growth. All right, again, these are all going to link together, so let me carry on for a bit. I'm going to move us into the next section. So give me a moment. All right, so if we've spoken about networks, about being empowering, what about moving towards experimentation from prediction? So like I said, a lot of this is about our illusion of control. And I say illusion because I walk around wanting to feel like I'm in control fundamentally of my finances, of my health, of time, of others, of my behavior. And the degree to which that's true is, you know, debated for centuries of philosophers on free will. I argue it's less true than we perhaps think it is day to day. In organizations, our need for control is typically incredibly high. So this is the thing I get most from people. But wouldn't it be chaos? You know, if everyone was empowered and autonomous, wouldn't it just be chaos? I can't tell you how many times I've had this. The quickest answer I can give is, in order to work like this, you need way more structure than you do in a hierarchy. Now, the reason for that is because we're not just getting rid of hierarchy and saying, all right, off you go, everyone. No, we're replacing the things that hierarchy was supposed to get done with processes that do that, right? So in the example of a meeting, we still had a facilitator. Now, that facilitator has no power over anybody else. They do have power over the process of how the meetings run, right? And that is a structure. But not all structures are very good. We also know what it's like to be in too much structure. So hopefully here's a spectrum for you. On the right, you have chaos, right? So I Googled, I'd been there a few years ago, I Googled traffic in New Delhi to get that picture on the right. And on the left, I Googled traffic lights or crossroads in America, right? So I've got the US and I've got India with my structure to chaos going on here. And the thing about the chaos side, first of all, I wouldn't want to drive in that scenario. I imagine there's quite a few accidents. I imagine there's a lot of traffic jams. Having said that, there's an enormous amount of skill. For example, people driving there will often use the horn not to be angry like in the UK, but to say I'm coming to your right or I'm coming to your left. So they're actually driving with sonar as well, right? So there's an incredible ability to adapt. Whilst the traffic lights, it's the computer deciding for you what you do. So you're no longer driving in a sense. The computer has said, go, don't go. That's not my decision to make anymore. And that, I think, is what bureaucracies do to us. So the paramedic, in his mind, it was a red light. Like, just can't do it. You know, computer says no. What we're looking for is this sweet spot in the middle. And these are structures They're just enough. So they're the least we need, but we do need them. We certainly don't want less. And they have they ideally are fluid and live and don't take away our autonomy. And this is, I Googled Swindon roundabout just because it's 5 roundabouts on a roundabout, which is silly, really, I think. But what roundabouts have over the traffic lights, far more traffic gets through a roundabout. That's because there's no situation where you're waiting at a red light, but no one's going through a green light. As soon as there's a moment, you're allowed to take it, right? There's no technology, so they don't break down, so fewer down days. The technology doesn't break, so that doesn't cost much, so they cost less, right? The benefits of a roundabout are huge, but the main benefit to a roundabout is that it's a really good way for drivers to stay good at driving. Because when I come to a roundabout, there's a few guidelines. Look to the right, and then it goes, go if you can, don't go if you can't. That's basically it. And so I have to constantly use my judgment. So I get better at using my judgment. Whereas there's way more accidents, I think accidents and particularly deaths at traffic lights than there are on roundabouts, because we don't have to think. So taking away thought from people is an incredibly dangerous, slow, ineffective, expensive thing to do. So what we want is more of these middle ones. So I want to apply this metaphor to decision making. And to do that, I just briefly need to teach you to suck eggs. So bear in mind, I'll try not to do that too much. But I need to talk about risk. The reason, because we're control freaks, we don't want to let people make decisions that could be risky. But I think we misunderstand risk. Risk is the likelihood of something going wrong, right? But some things can go wrong and it doesn't matter, right? So drawing, the example is we often feel scared of drawing. I see it in creativity workshops, and it's because I know I'm bad at drawing. But what's the risk? A bit of reputation or something, I don't quite know. So what matters is not just risk, but the consequences of our risk. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at it through this prism, that low risk, low consequence, that's a small decision. Medium risk, medium consequence. So it could go wrong, and if it does, it could be bad. Then we've got large risk, large consequence. That's it. It probably will go wrong, and if it does, it probably will be bad. And then there's extra large, right? So, and the way we're going to look at this is through this analogy. So you have a boat here. It's on the North Atlantic, and it hits into a very big iceberg in the middle of the night. And what matters here is it matters whether it hits the iceberg above or below the water, right? Because if it hits the iceberg above the water, nothing goes wrong. You know, a few people might fall off, but the whole ship isn't going to sink. But if it hits the iceberg beneath the water, the ship sinks, right? So that requires a different level of caution. So what we have at the bottom is very high consequence to our decisions. And so with high consequence should come high caution, or perhaps low speed. Perhaps we make the decision slower or something, a bit more rigor. Now, the problem is that in organizations, what we do is when it's below the waterline, we default to asking the boss. We default to authority, right? Which is why you're being asked permission. It's because someone immediately is defaulted to authority. They've basically gone teacher or mummy and daddy. That's the dynamic that we're just playing out in adulthood, I believe. And what I'm asking us to do is to shift the dynamic from the boss at the bottom to the individual at the top. So let me show the next one. So what I'm going to ask us to do is to default to the individual. So that means for small decisions, just do it. You decide, particularly if your roles and responsibilities are clear, then it's your authority, your accountability. When a decision's slightly bigger, then I'd say we can still make our own decisions, but it's useful to ask for advice. So I think someone shared this in the chat earlier, you know, this idea that we go and ask a bunch of colleagues for advice is really valuable, and call this the advice process. So what that means formally is I've got a proposal, right? I want us to go and do this cool thing. And I'm going to ask you all for advice. I'll ask probably 3 to 5 people who are affected or people who have expertise. And then, having listened to you all, I'm now going to announce my decision. And I'll do it publicly. So I'll do it in a public Teams channel or something like that. And that way, I've hopefully tweaked my idea slightly based on the advice. I might not have, because the advice might have been contradictory. So I'm still using my own common sense here. This is still the roundabout situation where I get to choose. And by sharing the decision publicly, I'm held to account that I did have to listen. I couldn't just go and do whatever I wanted, right? A bit more dangerous, we asked for consent. Now, consent is a slightly different scenario, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but it basically allows someone to veto. And then finally, if things are really dangerous, we could get consent, but we could also get the boss in the room. Although I have several examples where we no longer have the boss in the room. It's just not necessary anymore. And that's because the other people in the room are able to give their consent or block a decision because they have knowledge from across the business. You might have someone from financing, you might have someone who has the area of expertise, and quite often they'd actually be more knowledgeable than the boss would have been anyway. So this is what it starts to look like, right? So when we let's put this one, when we get to the top, we use consent. When we're in the center, we use advice. When we're at the bottom, we just do it. Now, a little word on consent, because I'd love to give you that as a tool. And in fact, I'll share a link with templates on how to do it at the end. Consent-based decision-making is for bigger, harder decisions that could be dangerous. And the way it typically goes is we get a group of 3 to 5 people who have expertise, and I make a proposal. So I propose that we spend £1 million on our next team building away day, right? And I propose that, and then I'm going to get your reactions as a team. I imagine a few of you might say, John, that's a bit overkill. The Maldives just for a strategy day seems a bit much. And then I'll get your advice. So you might say, okay, I know you wanted the Maldives, but actually there's this really lovely space in the South Downs we could go to. And, I hear there's an all-you-can-eat buffet and it's a bit cheaper. And I'll get a few of your ideas. And then having listened to your ideas, I'm now going to articulate my proposal. And what I'd probably do is I'd say, okay, I think it should cost us 10 grand. And yeah, it's like in the Lake District. And then, this is importantly, I'll ask you all, is it safe to try? And typically I do it non-verbally. So most people go, yeah, safe, safe, safe. And then the finance director goes, not safe, £10,000, that breaks our bank right now. So then we'll listen, we'll go, okay, 10 grand, that was a bit too much. I was trying my best, So then I'll change my idea until it's safe. And at some point, the whole group will say, safe to try, safe to try, safe to try. And typically in 15 minutes, I've seen people make very expensive decisions that otherwise would have taken months to make, or would have got stuck in bureaucracy. So consent is we want no no's. We want no disagreements. We're not looking for everybody to love it. We're not looking for everyone to say, I think that's the best idea in the world. We're looking to progress rather than get halted by this idea of perfection. And this expression, I would really love to sort of leave with you as a management tool, which is to ask, is it safe to try? That's a lovely way of getting experimentation through. So with that in mind, Elle?
Next poll coming up. So the question for this one is, how experimental is your team? On a scale of 1 to 5, very experimental, all the way down to very predicting. Last few moments to get your votes in. All right, we're gonna leave it there. Here are the results. A little different.
Yeah, a little lower, isn't it?
Yeah, so more folks feeling like there's quite a lot of predicting and a bit less experimenting happening. A little less, is it safe to try happening in their teams at the moment. This is certainly something that we hear from a lot of you, is that this is a particular challenge there's around this. And with that in mind, we had another question for you. What is a tiny experiment you could run to help you experiment more? What's something you could test or you could try? Or another question you might like to answer is, what might you be able to do without permission?
So good.
What are those things that you perhaps have been asking permission for that you don't need to? Again, take a moment to journal or pop your reflections in the Zoom chat.
Like, you know, permission to be ever so slightly naughty, basically. My son is a real rule follower. He's 13. And recently he started hanging out with a couple of kids who are a bit naughty. And I'm quite happy about it. You know, they're not so naughty and worried, but they're naughty enough that I think it might help him. So requisite naughtiness.
I think that's required, you know, as running tilt. You can't entirely always do what you're told and what's expected. So there's definitely, in my experience, that's also a lot of how you get stuff done inside large organizations, which many of you I know are in, is that actually it's getting on with it. JFDI, as one innovation senior manager said to me, JFDI, Eleanor. It's definitely something to be.
And it's interesting, in the chat there's some comments about money and the charity sector and the accountability to spend well, and that's obviously totally understandable. Consent hopefully can help you do that. Typically you can even end up with thresholds. So I know one organization I work with, you know, under a certain threshold you do what you want. For expenses, this was above a certain threshold you have to get advice. Above an even higher such threshold you need consent. So there's ways of actually baking it into your policies. But the other thing is there's a cost to not experimenting. It's really, really important to understand that when we don't experiment and we try and predict, then when we do launch, we launch too big and we launch without having tested the waters small and learned along the way. So there's typically a more expensive break when it does come. So I would actually fail cheaper would almost be the way to do it. You know, make your failures very cheap.
As well as at Tilt, what we find really helpful, as well as talking about the opportunity cost of not doing a thing, Yvette, we also find it really useful to talk about we're actually responsible inside charities for delivering positive impact in the world before we're responsible. That the reason it's just that a key way we do that is through focusing on where our money is spent. So trying to shift that conversation towards impact and towards risk of not trying can be ways to create some more space within which to experiment.
Yeah, beautiful. It's like that classic, are you motivated by fear or by love? Money often gets us into a scarcity mindset. This is brilliant. I'd also love you to just have a little think in your mind about yourself and your personal life. You know, it's very often that have you got permission to do something nice for yourself, or you're not allowed to do that, you know, in your partnership or in your own mind, in your sense of guilt, whatever that might be. There's all sorts of ways in which we don't give ourselves permission as well, don't try new things. All right, so last but not least, moving from isolation to transparency. So this one's really key because a lot of the others work better with it, right? Transparency or being informed. We just spoke about decision making. Being informed is a principle of a healthy democracy. And when we're not informed or misinformed, democracies fail, right? And the same goes for any form of coordination. When we're trying to coordinate large groups of people, particularly beyond tribal size, to do good work, it's good to have access to the same information. But what often happens is we get into filter bubbles. To try and demonstrate this, the visualization you see at the back is the 2016 US elections represented as the Facebook algorithm showed. So what it shows is that Democrats all followed Democrats and Republicans all followed Republicans. And the same would have happened for Brexit. Remainers and Brexiteers would have had two different ones. And if you're anything like me, you had the experience of waking up in the morning and what happened in the world, or at least the result, which was 52-48 from what I can remember, being very different from my news feed, where there was only one outlier. I actually remember the person, right, which says how few there were. And so what that tells you is that my idea of the world was utterly false. And that's because I was stuck in an echo chamber. Now that's social media, but in organizations more and more, email is a massive echo chamber because the only person in my and Eleanor's emails is us. So none of you got access to that information, but we do it in Teams as well. So what I'd love you to do, if you've got your Teams app open, this would be great. If you don't use Teams, I don't use Teams, so you might use Slack or you might use something else. I'm curious, how many teams are you in? So with those on Microsoft Teams, I'm specifically thinking a team, not a channel. So the team is the big one that you can collapse and expand. It typically has a little square icon with the initials of the team in. And I'd love you to put in the chat, how many teams are you in? So you might just write 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever comes up for you. So Susie's in 33. All right, and this is going to be interesting. So I'm just going to say 33, 13, 4, 25, 11, 12. Some hidden teams, 30, 15, 4, 19, 5, 14. There's a sub-teams comment. I'm going to bring that up in a minute because it's very important, actually. So I've done this. So you're all from different organizations, right? But I've done this within an organization. And actually, weirdly, I had pretty much exactly the same. I had someone say 4 and someone say 33. But they worked in the same organization. So look at my visualization in the background and think of how small one of the bubbles would have been and how big the other one would be. I.e., they're swimming in different information seas. One's in a swimming pool and one's in an ocean. And the difference is that one person has access to all sorts of information from around the organization. They're picking up on small things like nuance, tone, mood, maybe. They're getting information like, I don't know, a new product release or a great thing that's happened or an emergency that's going on. And they're sensing, then there's all the stuff that we're sensing that we don't know that we're sensing, particularly interpersonal dynamics. And that person who's in 4 teams, they're not getting most of that. So their view of the world is different. It's like reading a different paper. And it's why we should all read newspapers we utterly disagree with as well, because then we understand how actual people think, not just people like us. And this is really, really important in organizations. Now, the sub-teams point was interesting. I do have a piece of advice for you. And that's let me share this and then I'll come back to that. So I would really recommend this TED Talk, The Military Case for Sharing Knowledge, by General Stanley McChrystal. His book's called Team of Teams. The TED Talk is 6 minutes. So really good, really short and good for sharing with your teams. And he's got this great quote. I used to deal with intelligence agencies and I'd complain that they weren't sharing enough intelligence. And they'd say with a straight face, they'd look at me and they'd say, what aren't you getting? And he'd say, well, I don't know. If I knew that, I wouldn't have a problem. So the point here is, you know stuff that I don't know, but I don't know what it is that you know that I don't know. And the only way we can figure that out is for you to share it all with me in the first place, right? Because I don't know what the exceptions are because they're hidden from view. So we have to speak in the open. And this is a real mindset shift. It's a shift from this. This is a NASA picture. I can't remember if it's the UK or the US from above. So what you can see is a patchwork of farms, right? And the problem with this is that the ecosystem can't survive here because there's no sharing of information between habitats. This is an old farm in Sussex, near where I live, and they've moved towards wilding. And the first thing they've done is taken all the fences down. And so what starts to happen is the animals start to roam between habitats, and the space between them are actually called super habitats. So they benefit from the life and nutrients from both habitats. And what you see is a massive flourishing. So, the habitats go from being siloed to collaborative, from being very resource intensive to requiring relatively low resources, from being not very resilient because they have a single point of failure typically to being highly resilient. And in an organization, and actually I'd argue in nature as well, you go from low creativity from high creativity. And this is a real mindset shift in terms of how we organize our department. So you saw it with the hierarchy to networks, but also with information. So I call this letting grow, right? If we do this with our information, we allow people to make better decisions faster. And we see as leaders, it's beautiful because you just see problems get solved before you even got to them because someone else from the crowd did it. So a couple of practical tips to round up this bit. Work in the open is essentially the tip. I have several organizations where we've totally killed off internal email and instead we use public channels. If you're using something like Teams, the ideal setup, I believe, is one team and everyone's in that team, and then tons of sub channels where you're very specific that this is for a client or a project or a particular thing that you're running. So the channels are quite well organized and listed, but the team is just one and it's for everyone. Then you might make some exceptions. Some people like to keep salaries private, for example, right? But I would bias towards everyone has access to everything. And I would do the same for your documents. Try to move from definitely no hard drives, ideally no personal SharePoint either. Put it in a team folder so that everyone in the team has access to that. Your team meeting agenda, pin it to the top of the Teams channel so that anyone from your team can just click and go straight in to see the last meeting. It's a real game changer, I think. So someone who had the sub teams earlier, I actually think that's really good practice if I'm understanding correctly what you're doing there. So we're on to our last one.
This is our final poll. I'm sure you won't be surprised by this point. The question is, how transparent is your team on a scale of 1 to 5? 5 being very transparent, 1 being very isolated.
And thanks for those who, I know some of you had to head off because it's 1 o'clock, but thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, and we will be sharing a recording in via the newsletter shortly, as well as a little write-up. All right, let's see how you all voted. Feeling a little better about transparency. Roughly, yeah, either quite transparent or about in the middle. So as well as that, we wanted to invite you to reflect on a couple of questions on how you might encourage more transparent working in your world. So some of the questions are, how might you work in public more? How might you work out in the open a bit more? What private things might be safe for you to make open? And really tangibly, what files or folders might you put in a publicly accessible space? There's some lovely examples of this in terms of working in public more is something called week notes, where we see individuals inside organisations writing a little weekly update, what they did this week. And that's something you might find people sharing on LinkedIn, on Medium. Some people even do it internally within their organisations. That's a nice prompt to help share knowledge across the sector or across the organisation. Something that we encourage at Tilt, we use Mural a lot. So we use it like an online whiteboard, and we encourage everyone to make those mural boards completely transparent so that anyone can see them. Same if you use Trello or any other tools, where might you be able to just click that button to make them completely open to everyone. Hayley's saying we've got a shared departmental calendar so we can see all of the discussions are happening and when. Yeah, so even as simple as not making your calendar private. What were you going to say, Jon?
I was going to say the other thing is moving. If you can't make it edit, I try and default to everything's editable. Sometimes I don't want that because I don't want them to mess up a thing I've made. So then I make it commentable, right? Which at the very least people can write in the sidebar, and that can be valuable as well. That's another way of thinking about this openness.
Interesting point there, Nicole. We don't find people read the notes. It's more noise in a very noisy world. Agree. There's also something about organising that information, isn't there? Jon, have you got some?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I do think there's a trade-off. You know, the digital world we live in is noisy. There's a few things. You can change notifications to a degree that is very helpful. Like less appears in the side. People don't get constantly notified, at least if their name isn't used, so you only get notified if your name's mentioned. There's a bunch of things like that that clear, I'd say, like 60% of the clutter. Then there's learning to manage our minds and attention in the face of digital overload, which I think, you know, we should probably teach ourselves a lot younger. It definitely is a little bit of a trade-off. I choose noise and transparent, even over isolated, but some peace. I have a few routines. I turn off all my notifications for 2 hours, so none before 10, and then just after lunch, I have an hour or two without any notifications. Things like that can be helpful, but getting everyone to adopt those rituals is not necessarily straightforward.
Lovely to hear Caroline May doing a monthly work update to the department to give take-home messages, which is great. And there's also something there from Helen about how, thinking carefully about the type of content you share, the channels you use, so that it's the information that you're sharing is accessible. I think the key thing to remember also is that we're not advising that you tell everybody everything, that you go out and shove it at them, but instead that it's there and it's accessible. That's really the key. So they don't have to be, there may be some information that they do need to be told, but you don't have to share everything you don't have to send it to them. It's just making sure that it's available, so that what it could look like is when someone comes to you for an update on a project, instead of you having to jump on a 45-minute call where you talk them through it, you just send a link to your Kanban board, because it's transparent and they can see everything there, for example.
Yeah, that's it. I think, Karen, what you're doing sounds like a really good approach, to have this open SharePoint. And then, there's something about some channels trumping others, like the must read channel is a useful thing to do with summaries and stuff. All right.
Fab. So in a moment, I'm gonna let's have some Q&A with Jon. I know there's been tons of questions in the group. We're gonna have some time for you to ask Jon your questions and for us to share our answers as well. I'm sure there's some wisdom, a ton of wisdom within the group. But before that, Ro is here with us from Tilt, and she is going to tell us about 2 opportunities coming up. If you want to continue to embed these ways of working and think about what it might look like inside your world, then she is here to tell you more about 2 ways that you can do that. Over to you, Ro.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, great to be here. So 2 things, the first of which is the Agile in Action course. So really excitingly, we have 2 cohorts this autumn, one starting in September, one starting in November. And it's really for anybody who wants to gain confidence and a bit of experience and support in applying agile ways of working. So it provides kind of some foundational knowledge, but what's really brilliant about it is coming together with a group of people and supporting each other with experiencing and implementing things that you want to do in whatever context you're in. So whether you're working cross-function, whether you're looking at team, whether you're looking at project, whatever it is you're doing, to think about how we can apply the principles, that mindset that we've been talking about today. What does that look like? And to really support that implementation and that experimentation over 6 weeks, and then beyond, because of the relationships that then have been built through those 6 weeks. So yeah, the next one starts on the 17th of September, and then we've got a cohort starting in November as well, which is really great. And then we also have an opportunity to come along to the Charity Agile Leaders Club. I think we've got a slide for that. Yeah, which is monthly-ish space, which is free and informal space. And as Elle mentioned, is this kind of crowdsourced approach. So again, if you're interested in how you might do things, or you're trying to do things in relation to agile ways of working, the agile mindset, come along. You can come along, and then we introduce ourselves. So it's a great place for building relationships with other people, thinking and talking with other people through different ideas. But what's especially great about it is we invite people to say, what is it that you'd most like to talk about today? We vote on that, and then we work our way through kind of peer coaching, peer supporting, crowdsourcing ideas, sharing experience from different contexts, so that you really get that sense of community beyond the teams that you're working with, or especially if you're feeling a little bit isolated, this is a great space to just freely come along and join a community of really brilliant people doing great work.
Thanks, Ro. And Ro will be leading both of those, so you get to spend lots of time with Ro, who has embedded agile ways of working inside her team when she was at Amnesty. Thanks, Ro. So now is your opportunity, everybody, to ask Jon some questions. What are those burning questions that you have that you would like to ask Jon? Feel free to pop them in the chat, or if you'd rather, please do raise your hand. You can use the raise hand function in Zoom, which is along the bottom of your screen under reactions, and you can click raise hand, and then that will pop you to the front of the queue, and you can ask Jon a question you have. Or if you'd rather pop it in the chat and I can read it out for you. What more do you want to know about creating autonomous teams other than, Jon, can you come and do it for us? Which is a legitimate question, and yes, he can.
Yes, definitely. I'd love to help. And actually, meanwhile, whilst you think of your questions, I'll share 2 links. And the first one is to a template for crowdsourced team meetings, along with a video of how you might run one. And I'll also share one for consent-based decision making, whilst you ponder on any questions you might have. Nice, thanks for joining, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole. I have a question if no one else has one, which I'm wondering, could you...
You can have disagreements as well. Disagreements are welcome. Oh, we've got Emily.
Ah, okay. A disagreement. Emily.
I'm really interested to hear your question as well, Anna. And it was just reflecting on like how, particularly when you're like sharing responsibility, how that then affects your recruitment and like what levels that, for us, that feels like often one of the reasons we end up in a hierarchy is that I would say people feel like, oh, I'm like, that's not my responsibility. It's like, it's above my pay grade, effectively.
Yeah.
And I just wondered how, thoughts on that.
That's it. That's a good and annoying question, Emily, because it is complicated, that bit. But I can give you some answers. So when you look at the roles that are in, remember I showed those circles, right? Some of those roles are, let's say, task focused, like they're quite small, quite tactical, for example. Some will be project or team focused, so they're definitely at this point you're starting to take responsibility for things that are broader, and some are organizational focused. So for example, if someone has a role that is organizational strategy, and so implicit in that is that there is a hierarchy, right? It's just a bit different because I don't have power over you, but I have power over the strategy role. And because the strategy role is so broad, it is, if we were thinking of a weightlifting analogy, it's a big weight to be lifting. And so with those tiers is typically one of the ways in which we look at pay, basically. It does bring up what you're saying does bring up the question of job titles. Now, fully self-managed organizations do that a bit differently. Some do have job titles, some don't, but what they do is they allow teams to put whatever they want to put externally. When recruiting in the job ad, there's typically a job title as an entry point, but there'll also be a real description of what the culture is like here. And that is a point I want to make. When recruiting, to be honest, regardless of whether you want to change a hierarchy or not, I would be very interested in trying to bring in people who you think are able to work with a degree of autonomy. If nothing else, because it will shift the overall culture, which will typically be slightly parent-child rather than adult-adult. I hope that answers what was quite a complex question. So
Juicy question. Thanks, Emily. Caroline May, you've got a question.
Hi there. Sorry, I couldn't find my virtual hand. Thank you. Really great talk. I guess just experience from me. So I've sort of developed a new kind of strategy cross-org working group, and I've really tried to set the culture of, I want the team to be empowered. I want people to lead on, areas where they're expert at, and want people to try new ways, and we don't have to get everything right, and being really upfront and transparent with kind of how I want to lead the team. But there are sort of members that are just very used to, just from kind of normal ways of working, of just being told what to do. This is kind of your job description. This is what your kind of day-to-day looks like. And I think they feel really uncomfortable coming into that environment where maybe with other teams or other managers that they work with, that's not the sort of culture. So I guess how do you balance people working in two different environments within the same organization, and how can you get people to maybe lean more into that empowerment?
It's a really classic dynamic you're experiencing. So first of all, just well done for sticking with the slightly muddy section in between. It's simple to be in one paradigm or another paradigm. It's difficult to have one foot in either. So it's natural that you experience that, I think. The kind of tips that come to mind, or patterns, let's say, that I've noticed. One is a degree of compassion. I think I used to be a little bit too clumsy about this, but to understand that for many people, including myself in many contexts, I struggle to change. And so having some patience, compassion, meeting someone where they are feels really important to me. Having said that, progress is also important, and if after a while we're not getting somewhere, that starts to create burdens on the whole. What I do experience is when we really live by these principles, those who struggle to, I have typically found they leave of their own volition, and that could literally be because it's not right for them. And that's, I would just say, everyone's won out in that situation. But there is a kind of filtering process that happens. Like, it's very uncomfortable to not take responsibility when everyone else is. If you imagine if we were to be, I don't know, cooking a meal together, and three of us are really working hard and one person's just sat down, and you're like, that person knows it feels awkward to be in that situation too many times running. So I do think there's a natural filtering process. Transparency is a really key one, because you can't hide in that kind of environment. So yeah, there's a kind of harshness potentially to some of the things I'm saying, but hopefully you can hear there's also a softness in a desire to coach and support somebody. But there's got to be a point, I think, where wherever your threshold is, and you decide there's enough's enough at some point.
Brilliant. And if I could just get another question in, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So I guess another sort of point of tension or friction is kind of, I guess, an organizational business plan. So they're very clear on the organizational values, the mission, everything like that, especially, I guess, in a charity, that's really, really key.
Yeah.
And it's a long process of consulting with everyone around what those kind of business case plans are. What we're trying to do right now is what the organization wants to be in 2 or 3 years' time. But right now, the culture and the, I guess, experience of the organization is not ready for that 2-3 year timeline. But we're trying to set the foundations now. And I think that's a point of friction, because it's almost like that's not how we operate now. They're aware that will be changing in a couple of years' time, but I guess, how do you get that sort of working with those teams that
Am I right that the friction is that you're trying your best here to work very consultatively or collaboratively, and the organization is not used to that?
Yeah, so I guess just a sort of a bit of context to that. So my sort of experience is funding research. So I've come from another organization that funds a lot of research, and I've moved to another organization, and their ambition is to fund more research, but historically that's kind of not what the public or what their sort of identity is. It's around sort of hospital services. And so the ambition is in a few years' time to really ramp that up, and they have this strategy to do that. But we need to start funding research now, so that in a couple of years' time we can talk about that and we can say the impact of that, and they're aware of that. But I think what we're trying to do in our team to start getting these initiatives off the ground, there's a bit of resistance or friction to kind of say, but that's not what we do right now. We'll do that in 2 years' time. So they're sort of thinking, would that just almost kicking it down the road a little bit? But it's yeah, and it's trying to understand we need to do this now so that we're in the best possible position, then, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, Eleanor, you might be able to help me answer this as well, but my sense is that a spirit or a process of prototyping could be valuable, because for many, including me, it's difficult to imagine a thing that doesn't exist in 3 years' time. But if there's some sort of practical outcome that's safe to try in the next few months, very quickly I feel able to do slightly bigger and slightly bigger. And then in 3 years' time, mindsets change, the situation changes. But having that spirit of prototyping might mean you don't need to sell or prove anything, because the results have shown themselves. I'm not sure what you think on that.
I'm thinking, I mean, you could pick any one of the phrases that you've heard Jon use. I'm also thinking of, there may be a place for ask for forgiveness, not permission. What can you do? What can you just get on with and do? Does everybody need to be involved at this time? I'm also wondering about that, encouraging that question of, is it safe enough to try? So shifting that bar from kind of asking them, do you veto this? Is there any reason why this is not safe to try? Rather than saying, do you agree and are you on board? Instead, lowering the question that you're asking them. So yeah, it could be using that. I'm sure there's other things that have come up, and feel free, anybody else who's got any other words of wisdom to share, or ideas with Caroline May, because yeah, that is a tricky one when you're trying to shift things ahead of time, when you don't yet have clarity on exactly what it'll look like, and you don't yet have the buy-in. But
constant tension is between the individual and the collective. I as an individual want to do this, and that promotes speed, but it can be entrepreneurial and chaotic. However, if we're constantly doing everything as a collective, we might be aligned, but typically it's taking a long time, it's sapping creativity. So we're trying to seek some ability to do both. So Caroline, it might be worth you doing what you can as an individual, getting some input and thought, and then going again, input and thought, going again. And we have to be slightly happy to do a piece of work that not everyone's going to like, and then listen, and then move forward again. And I think we end up in a good position.
Julia has another question that you might consider, or another framing, which is, what would you need in order to say yes to this?
Yeah, that's really nice.
We really like that question, putting the responsibility on them to think about what would need to change in order for them to be ready to say
often
yes
I'll
to
ask someone, what would make this safe to try? So the only thing you can come up with is something that will help in making the thing better.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks both.
Thank you everyone for your questions. We'll need to leave the questions there. Before we head off, a few notes on where you can find out more about Jon, us, etc. While we're doing this though, this has been I'd love to ask for your feedback. This has been quite a different summer story season to our usual approach. Usually I'm interviewing someone from within a charity who has embedded agile ways of working. This has felt quite different. I'd love to hear your reflections. Feel free to send them in the Zoom chat. Open an email now to me and email me, or if you want to send it directly to me in the Zoom chat, you can pick my name in the drop-down list rather than everyone, and so you can send it to me personally. I just love to know, how did you find this? Would you like more summer story seasons like this? Do you prefer to the kind of real life case studies? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you would like to receive the recording and the write-up of this session, as well as previous ones from this summer story season, Rosies and Gemmas, sign up to our newsletter. Julia will pop the link in the chat. Jon, how should people get in touch with you if they want to hear more about what you're up to and follow you?
I'll put a little bit in the chat. My website's jonbarnes.me. No H. I've put my email there. You can find me on LinkedIn. I love chatting, so feel free to just send, thoughts, questions, cool stuff you've seen. I'm pretty open and collaborative, so it's been a pleasure being with you all.